Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to be here once again and to have some former students in the audience. Now, those former students know that technology, modern technology, and I do not get along at all. In fact, I am a jinx with it, and the jinx worked again tonight. I was going to show you a few images of Roosevelt and Churchill. That's not going to happen. Looking around, hopefully everyone in this room knows what Roosevelt looked like and what Churchill looked like. All right, so we can just go then. Where do we start? I think we start with our image of World War II, which was largely formed by Churchill's award-winning 6-volume history of the war, published between 1948 and 1953. If you want to get some idea of the impact that those 6 volumes had, just think about it. Well, the technology's even screwing me up here. Come on. No, that's not going to work. Okay, I'm just going to use the regular clock then and stay within the 50-minute time period. Just look at his titles: The Gathering Storm, Their Finest Hour, The Grand Alliance, The Hinge of Fate, Closing the Ring, Triumph, and Tragedy. And in those 6 volumes, Churchill gave us a very detailed and personal history of what he labeled the, quote, special relationship between Great Britain and the U.S. during the war, and within that, his own very special relationship and friendship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But with the declassification of almost all British and U.S. World War II documents decades later, it became clear that what Churchill wrote in those volumes was far from a complete or an objective history. Instead, it was a lengthy memoir with political motivations masquerading as a history. Churchill knew it. History will bear me out, he said, particularly as I shall write that history myself. This is not history, he told one aide. This is my case. Well, all memoirs are like that. But we did not treat those 6 volumes as such because we had few other documents to work from, and we had nobody who could write as well as Winston Churchill could. For those of you who are interested in how these 6 volumes were written, how he got access to these papers, my colleague in England, David Reynolds, has written a wonderful book called In Command of History, which goes into detail how this was done. Now, what I would like to do here this evening is examine what we now know about the origins and the development of the personal relationship between these 2 men and the role it played in the creation and the functioning of the Anglo-American wartime alliance. Churchill, I'll tell you in advance, was quite accurate on some things, but not on others. Now realize we are dealing here with 2 very powerful and rather extraordinary political figures. Interestingly, each one came from I guess we'd call it an aristocratic family, and each was a fast rising star before and during World War I. But each was then considered politically finished by the middle of the 1920s. First, Roosevelt, because of his polio and the paralysis that followed in 1921 at the age of 39. Churchill, because he shifted parties twice. Once in 1904 from conservative to liberal, then in 1925 back to conservative, and because of the controversial stands that he took. His opposition to the independence of India, his opposition to the abdication of the king, his opposition to appeasement, which was very popular in the 1930s, and his reputation regarding alcohol. I'll deal with this a little bit later. Was Churchill an alcoholic? C.P. Snow once quipped, he was not an alcoholic, quote, because no alcoholic could drink that much. My colleague and friend Warren Kimball, who has written extensively about them, refers to him as alcohol dependent. I consider him a functioning alcoholic. There are a few of those around. Each of them reemerged phoenix-like during the 1930s. Roosevelt as governor of New York and then president in 1933. Churchill in 1939 as First Lord of the Admiralty, when it became obvious that appeasement had failed and that World War II was starting. He then, in 1940, became Prime Minister. Now, the two officially met for the first time in August of 1941, the Atlantic Charter Conference off the coast of Canada. But actually, they had met once in London during World War I. A meeting that Roosevelt remembered, but not nicely. He referred to Churchill as that stinker. And Churchill did not remember at all, which did not make Roosevelt very happy. But when Churchill rejoined the cabinet in 1939 as First Lord of the Admiralty, Roosevelt started what would become a very lengthy personal correspondence by inviting Churchill. And you invite the First Lord of the Admiralty, you are inviting Chamberlain, the Prime Minister at that time, but through Churchill to, quote, keep me in touch personally with anything you want me to know about. They're very typical of FDR style. That correspondence would expand massively when Churchill replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940. There would be in total 1,700 letters and telegrams between the two. My colleague Warren Kimball has published them in 3 volumes. That's how much space it took to go through all of them and to explain all of them. When Churchill takes over, Britain faces, I guess, catastrophe would be the only word. The Germans have conquered Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and then France. Britain stands alone. Roosevelt had, before this, come to view Hitler as a mortal threat and wanted to help Britain and France when it was still in the war, but he could not. Isolationism was extremely strong in the country at the time. Many of us who teach the field don't like the word. We don't think it's very accurate. Anti-interventionist might be a better term. Whatever you want to call it, the belief was very strong that U.S. entry into World War I had been a monumental error. World War I had not been the war to end all wars, as Wilson had said. It had not made the world safe for democracy. All it had done is set the table for World War II. And the United States should stay out of this second war, and the way to do that was to outlaw the acts that were seen as having led to U.S. entry in the first place. It's a shame. One of the images I wanted to show you, 1930s image, was of a young boy in a street, and he is looking up at a diseased prostitute. It's a skeleton. And the prostitute is saying to him, "Come on up, I'll treat you right. I used to know your daddy." Zing. Says it all. In any event, Congress passed a series of acts outlawing the sale of arms to belligerents, loans to belligerents, travel on belligerent ships, and any trade in American merchant ships. Only cash and carry. Roosevelt did not like these laws, but he signed them because he did not want to lose the support of these people if they were willing to support his New Deal bills. The New Deal came first. A dramatic shift occurred with the fall of France. Britain now stood alone. But Churchill refused to sue for peace. He rejected those in the cabinet who favored a peace with Germany, and a mediated settlement was indeed a possibility in May of 1940. Instead, you get Churchill's soaring rhetoric of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and finest hour. But Churchill's only real hope, to be totally honest, is American aid and eventual U.S. entry into the war. And I think you can see this combination in Churchill's June 4th Fight on the Beaches speech. And I'd like to quote to you from it. It's an extraordinary speech, and just wait for the zinger at the end. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island, or a large part of it, were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the New World, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the Old. There you have it, okay? The public. There is a huge shift taking place in American public opinion at this time and in Roosevelt's behavior. People have mobilized the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, the White Committee, one example of it. On June 10th in Charlottesville, Roosevelt denounces Italy for entering the war, and he denounces isolationism at the same time. Within the space of the next few months, he will create a bipartisan cabinet by appointing two Republican interventionists, Henry Stimson and Frank Knox, as Secretary of War and Navy. He shall also propose, and the Congress shall agree to, the first $1 billion defense bills in U.S. history. In fact, there is a 500% increase in U.S. defense spending during the spring and summer, and you also get the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. But major arguments ensue between Roosevelt on one side and his Army and Navy chiefs, as well as Congress on the other, over whether to sell any of this to Great Britain or keep it for the defense of the United States. As one of Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall's aides said, if we were to sell these guns and ammunition to the British and then were found to be lacking them, meaning we faced invasion and need them, he said, you and I might be found hanging from the nearest lamppost. They are playing for all the marbles here. Congress passes a law saying nothing can be sold to another country unless the Chief of Naval Operations or the Army Chief of Staff say it is not needed for the defense of the U.S. Roosevelt gets around this in September 1940 by swapping 50 overaged warships, World War I vintage warships, in response for base sites, British base sites in the Western Hemisphere, and his Chief of Naval Operations says the base sites are worth more than the warships. It is a net strategic gain for the country. Churchill had at first balked at terms for these 50 ships. The Americans also wanted a promise of no surrender or scuttling of the fleet. Churchill grumbled, empires just don't bargain, to which the U.S. Attorney General shot back, republics do. 70% of the public supported the destroyer bases deal, but only 5% supported U.S. entry into the war. And beyond this destroyer bases deal, Roosevelt would not go. He is running for an unprecedented third term. But with his successful re-election, Churchill decides it's time to level with him to an extent and to try to get the United States into the war. He sends what he will later call the most important message I ever wrote to the president, saying Britain is running out of money to purchase war materials and shipping to get that material across the submarine-infested Atlantic Ocean. And he asks for loans, U.S. merchant ships, naval escorts, as well as war material. Roosevelt says no. That would require repeal of the Neutrality Acts and probably a declaration of war that he feels he could not get. He decides instead to focus on the financial issue by removing what he labels at a December 17th press conference, quote, that silly, foolish old dollar sign. Suppose, he says in a radio address, your neighbor's house is on fire, and the neighbor says, let me borrow your garden hose to put out the fire. You're going to ask him for cash down on the barrel, or you're going to loan him the hose, and then when the fire's out, you will get it back. On that basis, he suggests that the United States Congress agree to lend or lease war material to any nation whose defense he deems vital to the security of the U.S. The United States, he says, on December 29th, should become the arsenal of democracy. He will also, just a week later, deliver the famous Four Freedoms address, asserting what America wanted in the world, even though it was not in the war yet. There were opponents to Lend-Lease. They had organized in, and it used to be that my students didn't know this term, but now I guess everybody does, the America First Committee. Members of that committee, led by General Robert Wood of Sears, Roebuck, and Charles Lindbergh, argue that Lend-Lease will lead to war, not keep the United States out. Senator Burton K. Wheeler calls it the New Deal's AAA for foreign policy. Instead of plowing under every fourth acre, it'll plow under every fourth American boy. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio compares war material to chewing gum. After it's been used, do you really want it back? The public seems to be in favor 2-1, and those votes come up in Congress. 60 to 31 in the Senate, and 317 to 71 in the House. Lend-Lease passes. At the same time, Roosevelt agrees to having Churchill send special British military representatives to secretly meet with their American counterparts to come up with a war plan in the event of U.S. entry into the war. This will be ABC 1 in the revised Rainbow 5 plan if the United States finds itself allied with Britain in a war against Germany, Italy, and the Japanese. The aim shall be to defeat the Germans first. Roosevelt also extends a hemispheric defense line far east, first to Greenland, and then to July. He beefs up the Atlantic Fleet. He, as well as Churchill, welcome Soviet leader Joseph Stalin as an ally when Hitler turns on Stalin and attacks him in June of 1941. I love Churchill's comment. His aide said, "Prime Minister, you're the most famous anti-communist in the world. How can you welcome Stalin as an ally?" "If Hitler invaded hell," Churchill replied, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Roosevelt also agrees to meet Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland in August. The result of that will be the Atlantic Charter. This is the first of 10 wartime meetings between the two men. They'll spend a total of 113 days together during the war, and it is the beginnings of what will become a deep personal friendship. But it is, in its origins, a political friendship. Churchill knew from the start that it was politically necessary to have a friendship with the American president. He said to Averell Harriman at the end of their first meeting, "But does he like me?" He realized just how important this was. Roosevelt did like him, albeit within limits set by his own personality as well as the political position that he held. The playwright and speechwriter Robert Sherwood commented many years ago on Roosevelt's, quote, heavily forested interior. This is not a man who makes friends, who has any deep friends. He uses people. I refer to it as this front of jovial simple-mindedness, behind which is an incredibly calculating mind. I love the crack of a Roosevelt biographer about having a recurring and maddening dream about playing cards with Franklin Roosevelt. And he's talking nonstop, fascinating conversation, but he's slipping cards off the deck and up his sleeve while he is talking, to which the biographer said, "I think it's safe to say all of Franklin Roosevelt's cards were never on the table." Churchill was disappointed with the Atlantic Charter. He had wanted U.S. entry into the war. He did not get it. Roosevelt was still fearful of isolationist pressures. Extension of the draft had passed Congress by only one vote in August of 1941. Contrary to what people think, that didn't mean the draft ended. It meant that those in the original draft who were told they would go home within 12 or 18 months were not going to go home. But that was still bad enough. And to this day, we don't know exactly what Churchill was doing here. What Roosevelt was doing here. He famously said at one point, "It's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder when you are trying to lead and to find no one there." He will not get ahead of public opinion. On the other hand, the King of England, who visited with him, told him in June of 41 that he had been struck, quote, "by the way you have led public opinion by allowing it to get ahead of you." I think in those two comments you can make up your own mind. Churchill reports that Roosevelt said he would wage war without declaring it, which is what he did in September, announcing that the USS Greer, a destroyer, had been wantonly attacked by a German submarine, and that he had given orders to the U.S. Navy to shoot on sight when it spotted German subs. He didn't mention that the Greer had been trailing the submarine and reporting its position back to the British fleet. By October, he is asking Congress to end the crippling provisions of the Neutrality Acts so that he could arm U.S. merchant ships, carry Lend-Lease supplies to Britain, and be escorted by the U.S. Navy. Congress agreed after the sinking of the destroyer Reuben James with the loss of over 100 U.S. lives. The United States was thus in an undeclared naval war with Germany before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor happened, of course, on December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese attacked British as well as U.S. possessions in the Western Pacific and Asia. This was followed by U.S. and British declarations of war on Japan, and then Hitler declared war on the U.S., thereby creating what we call the global World War II. In Churchill's famous words, Roosevelt's famous words, "We are all in the same boat now." In his memoirs, Churchill noted that he received news of Pearl Harbor the same day he received news of a Soviet counter-offensive in front of Moscow. The last German thrust towards Moscow had failed. And this is what he wrote: "So we had won after all. United, we could subdue everybody else in the world. Saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." Man did have a way with words. No doubt about that. But Churchill was fearful that because of Pearl Harbor, the United States would focus on the Japanese, despite the prior agreement to focus on Germany. So he decided to come to Washington right away to make sure this did not happen. The result is their second meeting, the so-called Arcadia Conference in Washington, in which some really important major decisions are reached. Germany first is reasserted. You have the principle of unity of command. In all theaters of war, all British and American Army, Navy, and air personnel shall be under a single commander from one of the two countries. You create the combined chiefs of staff, the British and the U.S. chiefs of staff, to run the war. But this, by the way, this is where you get the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. They did not exist before this. You also get what would become an enormous number of combined boards to run the war. Boards that will include sharing scientific research, high-level intelligence, everything, and you get a formal alliance. Throughout this lengthy conference, Churchill stayed at the White House as Roosevelt's guest. And this is where the friendship is really established. In fact, there's a famous story. Roosevelt was notoriously informal. He would just wheel himself into whatever room he wanted to. And so one day he wheels himself into Churchill's room just as Churchill is getting out of the bathtub. In his wheelchair, Roosevelt begins to back out. Churchill says, "Please, Mr. President, stay. His Majesty's First Minister has absolutely nothing to hide from the President of the United States." I prefer Roosevelt's telegram comment back to Churchill in February of 1942. "It is fun to be in the same decade with you." They are friends. And Churchill's crack about having nothing to hide is not quite true. There are major differences between the two nations. Proper combined strategy against Germany, the British peripheral strategy in the Mediterranean versus the American direct cross-channel strategy is a huge one. Post-war territorial accords. Stalin demands them. Churchill is willing to agree to them. Roosevelt is not. Future of European colonial empires. Roosevelt wants to end them, while Churchill is a strong defender of the British and the other European colonial empires. Post-war trade policy. The U.S. wanting a free trade policy, the British having an imperial preference system. And also, not to be forgotten, are the very different personalities, working hours, and drinking habits of these two. Now, Roosevelt did drink. It was referred to as he called it the children's hour. And he would mix the drinks himself. If you can imagine, for a martini, he'd mix with the gin sweet and dry vermouth in large quantities. As Kimball put it, Churchill learned to find flower pots and toilet bowls very, very quickly. Also, Churchill would keep Roosevelt up late and come up with these harebrained ideas that would infuriate the chiefs of staff. One time, they woke Marshall up and said, we think we should send an American army to the Suez Canal. Only Marshall could do this. At least this is what he told Stimson, that he said he refused even to discuss such a matter at that time of night and walked out on them. The British chiefs of staff, of course, could not do that. Churchill's behavior drove Eleanor Roosevelt crazy. Couldn't stand it whenever Churchill would come. And this was, he also came to Washington in May of 1943 for a conference and stayed at the White House again. Now, 1942 would be dominated by a huge strategic dispute, the end result of which will be that Roosevelt sided with Churchill and against his own chiefs of staff and agreed to an Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, Operation Torch. The operation succeeded, but Hitler's decision to take over Tunisia prevented final victory in North Africa until May of 1943. Now, if I had a whole other lecture, I would go into this little episode in great detail because it had profound consequences. The Americans had wanted to concentrate for crossing the English Channel. They wanted to begin concentrating in 42, maybe even cross if it was at all possible, and definitely cross in 43. Churchill said, we can't remain inactive. Let's do French North Africa in 42, and then we can do the Channel in 43. The Americans said, if you do French North Africa in 42, you're not going to be able to cross the Channel in 43. Churchill expected it to end in a couple of weeks. It didn't. It took 6 months. And thus, there is going to be no cross-channel attack until 1944, even though Roosevelt had, in a sense, promised it to Stalin in 1942, when Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov was visiting. But that is another story. The situation that Roosevelt and Churchill face when they meet next in January of 1943 in Casablanca is, well, what now? We are not going to be able to cross the Channel in 43. So instead, once we do take Tunisia, we're going to invade Sicily. We're going to launch the combined bomber offensive against Germany. We're going to give top priority to the U-boat war, but we are not going to cross the Channel until 1944. Now, most of this is not known. What is remembered about the Casablanca Conference is Roosevelt's announcement that Allied policy shall be unconditional surrender. He announces that as a press conference. There is much mythology here, partially due to incorrect statements that Churchill made in his memoirs. This did not come as a surprise to him or to anybody else. The only surprise was the timing at that particular press conference. Unconditional surrender had been discussed in London and Washington. Indeed, it had always been Allied policy and the lowest common denominator holding the Grand Alliance together. There had been a conditional surrender at the end of World War I. And what had you gotten? World War II. This time, Germany must surrender totally and unconditionally. There will be no stab in the back myth this time. Plus, how in the world can you negotiate with Adolf Hitler? Roosevelt enunciated it at this particular time in order to reassure Stalin in the light of no channel crossing and to reassure the public, which had been outraged over the fact that in the invasion of North Africa, Eisenhower dealt with a French collaborator, Admiral Jean Darlan. But in any event, Casablanca is now seen as the high point of the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill. They have private sessions in the evening. They drive together to Marrakesh, and Churchill has Roosevelt carried up 60 steps in a tower in order to see sunset over the Atlas Mountains. He calls it, quote, the most lovely sight in the whole world. He then paints that sunset for Roosevelt, and he goes to the airport at dawn to see FDR off. As the plane leaves, he turns to an aide and comments, quote, he is the truest friend. He has the farthest vision. He is the greatest man I've ever known. But then the disagreements come hot and heavy in 1943 and 1944. Continued disagreements over when to cross the Channel, how much to give to the Mediterranean, how much to give to the war against the Japanese. There is also the fact that by the fall of 1943, even though Churchill had agreed to cross the Channel in 44, he wants to delay again. Behind Churchill's back, Roosevelt had already tried to set up a private meeting with Stalin in Alaska. And when Churchill finds out about it, Roosevelt lies and said, "I did no such thing." The meeting never took place. Stalin canceled it when he found out the Channel was not going to be crossed until 1944. But in late 1943, with more and more promises, Stalin finally agrees to a meeting in the Iranian city of Tehran. And, excuse me, sorry to keep doing that, but I've been fighting off some interesting bugs that have invaded my own body, and I do need the water. At the Tehran conference, in effect, Stalin and Roosevelt gang up on Churchill and insist that the Channel will be crossed in May of 1944, come what may, and that there will also be an invasion of southern France. Roosevelt at the Tehran conference will needle Churchill mercilessly in an effort to establish a personal relationship with Stalin and disabuse Stalin of the notion that he and Churchill are ganging up on him. This worked to an extent. There's been a lot made of this, how naive Roosevelt was. He was not naive. He and Stalin wanted the same thing from a strategic point of view. Churchill did not at this point. And in addition, Roosevelt saw that Russia was a rising power, that the United States and Russia were going to be the great powers of the future. Britain had reached its mobilization peak by this point. And Roosevelt always believed that he could personally make friends with just about everybody. There is a notorious story told where they're saying, what are we going to do with the German general staff? And Stalin says, let's shoot 50,000 of them. That will make sure that Germany doesn't rise again. Now, Stalin was, of course, very capable of doing this. But the translator, Charles Bolin, said the word Stalin was using, he was needling Churchill, just to see what sort of a reaction he could get. And he got the reaction. Churchill exploded and stalked out of the room. Excuse me. Churchill exploded. I'm missing the story. Roosevelt intervened to say, gentlemen, let's compromise. Let's shoot only 49,000. At that point, Churchill stalked out of the room. But again, there is Roosevelt's attention and friendship are shifting to the more powerful person in the coalition. Remember, I told you from the start, this was a political friendship. Okay? It doesn't mean he dislikes Churchill. It just means when there are choices to be made, he will make the choices that he thinks will work best for his country. There are additional disagreements and divergence in 1944. The generals, Eisenhower versus Montgomery, on the broad versus narrow front strategy in Europe. The invasion of southern France, Churchill wants to scotch it and invade Yugoslavia instead. Roosevelt says, no way. You get the Bretton Woods agreements at that point, in which the United States illustrates its post-war economic dominance. And with that goes an insistence that Britain abandon imperial preference if it wants a continuation of Lend-Lease aid after German surrender, but before the Japanese surrender. In the Second Quebec Conference in the fall of 1944, Roosevelt had agreed to continue this Lend-Lease aid to help keep Britain afloat, and then seemed to forget it. And at one point, Churchill just lost it and said, "What do you want me to do? Get on my knees and beg like your dog Fowler?" Churchill is the supplicant. He had been the supplicant all along. But by the power of his personality and by the fact that Britain was fighting, he held his own with Roosevelt until this time, 1944, 1945. But Roosevelt is not the only one who will turn on a friend and try to arrange a private meeting with Stalin. When Churchill cannot get his way over what he wants in Eastern Europe, he flies to Moscow and signs a spheres of influence deal with Joseph Stalin. Roosevelt knew he was flying there and had some idea of what was going on. He didn't want it to happen, but it did happen. And here, let me quote to you from Churchill's memoirs. Those of you who still think that Roosevelt gave things away to Joseph Stalin. Churchill said to Stalin, "Let us settle about our affairs in the Balkans. Your armies are in Romania and Bulgaria. We have interest missions and agents there. Don't let's get at cross purposes in small ways. As far as Britain and Russia are concerned, how would it do for you to have 90% predominance in Romania and for us to have 90% of the say in Greece, and we go 50-50 in Yugoslavia?" While this was being translated, I wrote it out on a sheet of paper. Romania, Russia, 90%, the others 10. Greece, Great Britain, 90%, Russia 10. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia, 75%, the others 25%. I pushed this across to Stalin, who had by then heard the translation. There was a slight pause. Then he took his blue pencil and made a large tick upon it and passed it back to us. It was all settled in no more time than it takes to set down. After this, there was a long silence. The penciled paper lay in the center of the table. At length I said, "Might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of these issues, so fateful to millions of people, in such an offhanded manner? Let's burn the paper." "No," said Stalin, "you keep it." I'm telling you, truth is much stranger than any fiction you can come up with about the war. By that point, Roosevelt realizes that Churchill and Stalin are making territorial deals. There has to be another conference. And what you will get is the notorious conference at Yalta in the Crimea. There are a huge number of myths about Yalta. The one thing that is true is that Roosevelt is dying. He is clearly dying. One of the photos I was going to show you, you can see it. But his behavior was really no different at this conference than it had been at any other conference, and there was no giveaway. The mythology is Roosevelt gave away half of the world to Stalin. Well, that assumes that he had that half of the world to give away. In truth, Roosevelt did not give away a single square inch of territory occupied by U.S. or British forces in February of 1945. Indeed, if you looked at the map, you would say he got a good deal in terms of territory in Germany. Stalin's armies were only 35 to 45 miles from Berlin at the moment when Eisenhower was still fighting the Battle of the Bulge on the west side of the Rhine River. But most important, Roosevelt was not a peace conference. It was a conference on how to end the war and see if the Allies could compromise their post-war differences so that Germany would not rise yet again and begin a third world war. And when the conference ended, they all walked away thinking they had succeeded. Stalin got what he wanted in Poland because his army occupied Poland. But Roosevelt got what he wanted on both the United Nations and Soviet entry into the war against Japan within 3 months of German surrender. Those who say, well, who needed that? There was the atomic bomb. No, there was no atomic bomb in February of 1945. Furthermore, all three agreed to a military occupation of Germany and a declaration on liberated Europe. I'm going to say something that will be I think you will find quite controversial here. Did Roosevelt appease Stalin at Yalta? Yes. Did Roosevelt appease Churchill at Yalta? Yes. He backed away from the decolonization issue. Did Stalin appease Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta? Yes. Did Churchill appease Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta? Yes. Appeasement is not a dirty word. It became a dirty word in the 30s because it was misapplied for a man who could not be appeased in a situation in which it should have never been tried. But it is one of the oldest principles in diplomatic history, and it should not be considered a dirty word. It's also one of the oldest principles in human behavior. When was the last time you appeased a member of your family? Or a member of your family appeased you? And a bunch of us have got this thing that we've been poisoned into thinking, never appease. No, there are times when you do appease. And when you've got an alliance and are trying to end a world war, it's a good time to do so. What would have the agreements broke down very soon after the Yalta Conference. As Germany is collapsing, the agreements are collapsing. What would have happened had FDR lived? We'll never know. His last messages to Churchill and Stalin go both ways. One of his last messages to Stalin accuses him of trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Germans in Italy, and Roosevelt explodes and talks about the, quote, vile misrepresentations of your informers. This is not exactly diplomatic language. But then, and he adds, I cannot avoid a feeling of bitter resentment. Your informers, whoever they are, for such vile misrepresentations of my actions and those of my trusted subordinates. But then he writes to Churchill, I would minimize the general Soviet problem as much as possible because these problems in one form or another seem to arise every day, and most of them straighten out, as in this case. We must be firm, however, and our course thus far is correct. The next day, Roosevelt died. Churchill was stunned, and he dictated a message to Eleanor Roosevelt, quote, accept my most profound sympathy in your grievous loss, which is also the loss of the British nation and of the cause of freedom in every land. I feel so deeply for you all. As for myself, I have lost a dear and cherished friendship which was forged in the fire of war. I trust you may find consolation in the magnitude of his work and the glory of his name. So what then are we to make of this friendship and its importance? It was vital to victory in World War II and to the formation of the special relationship between the two nations that would continue throughout the Cold War era. But it was not the only Anglo-American friendship at a high level during the war. There were many, many others. And as I've tried to emphasize, it was a friendship based on, it was a relationship based on politics as well as friendship. And it was not a relationship of equals. In 1940, 1941, Churchill was a supplicant for aid, and Roosevelt was agreeable to aid to the extent that he believed he could get congressional and public opinion to support that aid. Then 1942 and early 1943, I'd say this is the time when they are closest to equals and on the same page. As together, they create a structure for unprecedented cooperation during the war, and they overrule their chiefs of staff and determine what the strategy is to be in 1942 and 1943. But then from late 1943 until the end of the war, Britain is in decline, whereas the Soviet Union and the United States are in the ascendancy. Britain has reached its mobilization peak, whereas the United States and the Soviet Union are clearly still growing and are going to be the world superpowers. And that affects Roosevelt's behavior. In addition, I would conclude that the friendship was never equal on a personality basis. Churchill loved Roosevelt. I don't think there's any question of that. I am not certain that Franklin Roosevelt was truly capable of loving anyone. You thought you were close to him, but nobody really got close to him. I have done research at Hyde Park, and when I do, I usually take a break at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and go for a walk, and I could swear I hear him laughing. Nobody is going to figure me out. He was, behind that front of jovial simple-mindedness is a very secretive man. Marshall brought a secretary in so that when he met with the president, there would be notes. Roosevelt would not allow the notes to be taken. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, in the middle of the war, wrote to Roosevelt, "We have got the full minutes of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Should we publish them?" The answer came back, no, those notes should never have been taken in the first place. This is the man, again, as Sherwood put it, with the heavily forested interior. And I go back to that wonderful comment of the biographer who had that nightmare of constantly playing cards with Roosevelt and watching him take cards off the deck and put them up his sleeve. I think it's safe to say all of Franklin Roosevelt's cards were never on the table. Yet, I go back to that wonderful statement that he made to Churchill in February of 1942. It is fun to be in the same decade with you. Thank you very much. Okay, question is, what about Churchill's relationship with Truman after FDR dies? It is on the one hand, it is very short-lived because Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. In July, you have the third meeting of the Big Three in the Berlin conference, in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. In the middle of the conference, Churchill is voted out of office. His party loses the British elections. Clement Attlee becomes the prime minister, and Churchill goes into the opposition. Now, what's fascinating is, it's while he is in opposition that he is writing these 6 volumes. But he's the head of the Conservative Party, and before he finishes, he will come back into office as prime minister so that there will be more with Truman and, of course, with Eisenhower. How did Eisenhower become the commanding general in Europe? I didn't set it up, but I'm telling you, I love that question. Wait till you hear the answer, because it does concern George Marshall quite a bit, okay? George Marshall, Roosevelt had jumped 33 senior generals to make Marshall his chief of staff. And Marshall is sworn in on September 1st, 1939, the day Hitler invaded Poland. Marshall talked back to Roosevelt. Marshall told his biographer, when I did at a White House meeting, it ended the meeting, everyone shook my hand and said it was a shame that my stay in Washington was going to be so short. Instead, 6 months later, Roosevelt says, "I want you," and Marshall says, "I'm going to tell you things you don't want to hear." He goes, I know. Marshall said, "You said that pleasantly. Let's see what happens." And they fought. They fought, but developed enormous respect for each other. Marshall puts together, when he had, in the 30s, when he'd been at Fort Benning, he had, in effect, created the new American High Command for World War II. 200 World War II generals went through Benning the years that he was there. Eisenhower was not one of them. But Eisenhower's mentor, Fox Connor, had been very close with Marshall during World War I. He had actually been his commanding officer in Pershing's headquarters in World War I. So Marshall had heard about Eisenhower, probably through Connor and through others. As soon as Pearl Harbor occurred, Marshall had also heard about Eisenhower because of the Louisiana maneuvers, where Eisenhower did very, very well. Marshall had called Eisenhower to Washington after Pearl Harbor and put him in charge of the War Plans Division. So in an incredible irony, it is Eisenhower who originally came up with the cross-channel plans that eventually led to Overlord. They were known as Marshall's plans, but Eisenhower was his war plans chief who actually wrote them. Marshall also sent Eisenhower to England to take over U.S. forces in England in 1942. And when he lost the battle over North Africa, and Roosevelt and Churchill overruled him and said, we are going to invade French North Africa. But Churchill said, we need an American commander for that, because the French will not take to a British commander very, very nicely, and we want to obtain French surrender as soon as we can. So Marshall appoints Eisenhower to lead that. He also, they do well, and well, in time, Eisenhower also leads combined forces for the invasion of Sicily and for the invasion of Italy. But everyone expected that for the cross-channel operation, it would be Marshall himself. That what would happen would be Marshall would take command, Eisenhower would come back to be the chief of staff, and that is the way the war would run. But other members of the Joint Chiefs said, Marshall is running a global war effort. You cannot spare him from Washington. And Marshall's mentor, General John J. Pershing, from World War I, is saying the same thing. What George is doing, no other human being can do. You cannot spare him. You cannot give him a single battlefield command, even if it is the greatest battlefield command in U.S. history. And Roosevelt refused to make a decision, something he often did, just avoid it, until Stalin called him and said, who's going to command this operation? And Roosevelt says, I haven't made up my mind yet. And Stalin says, nothing will come of it. So it's time to fish or cut bait. According to Marshall, Roosevelt called him into his room in Cairo as they were coming back from the Tehran conference and basically said, do you want it? It is yours if you want it. And Marshall said, I refuse to answer that question. You have to do what is best for the country, not what is best for George C. Marshall. At which point Roosevelt said, then it shall be Eisenhower. I could not sleep at night with you out of the country. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, at the end of the war, said, relating this story as well as many others, I have seen a great many soldiers in my day. You, sir, are the finest soldier I have ever known. Marshall could have had it by asking for it, but instead it went to his protege, Eisenhower. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell that story. Editing the Marshall Papers, it is one of my favorite stories to tell. Okay, what biography of Roosevelt would I recommend, and what biography of Churchill? How many volumes would you like to read? Okay. Okay. The first one I would recommend is by Warren Kimball. It's a dual biography of the two of them. And that way you get two for the price of one. And it's called Forged in War. Okay? If I wanted a biography of Churchill, you have to go, the official one by Martin Gilbert is the one you go to, but it's really huge. And I can't think of a one-volume biography. There are plenty. Jenkins, but most of them are just not coming to mind at this point. For Roosevelt, the first original classic is by James McGregor Burns. 2 volumes, the first one called Roosevelt, the Lion and the Fox, and the second one called Roosevelt, the Soldier of Freedom. That was the first one I ever read. I still think it is in many ways the best. Though obviously, the first volume was written in 1956, the second one in 1970. It won the Pulitzer Prize, but we have much more information now. And so I'm not really answering your question. I'm stalling to think of what more up-to-date one, short ones. There are no short ones. Anyone who writes about Roosevelt just writes these huge volumes. The only short one that I can think of offhand is by Patrick Maney, M-A-N-E-Y. And I will plead the effects of this illness, which has made my brain fuzzy. But if you wish, if you will email me, I will send you a complete list. And my email is mark.stoller@uvm.edu, and I'd be happy to send you a fuller bibliography. But I think if you want to take off from this lecture, I'd read the Kimball dual biography, Forged in War. It is scholarly, but it's written on a popular level. And Kimball was the editor of the complete Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence and is, I think, the world expert on the relationship between the two of them. Of course, just for the sheer joy of reading Churchill's 6 volumes about the war, though. On vacation. Be careful. Be careful in terms of what he claims. Let's put it that way. And also, please don't get me wrong. I have enormous respect for both men. I don't know what we would have done without them. Certainly, Britain would not have fought on without Churchill. Roosevelt, God knows what would have happened in the Great Depression to begin with, and then World War II. Roosevelt is always ranked as one of the top 3 of all American presidents, with good reason. But I'm not the type that goes for hagiography. These are flesh and blood human beings. They have their weaknesses, and they have their foibles, and what I try to do here is provide you with some balance and point out, if anything, if you look at all the differences that the British and the Americans had, what's incredible is how close the alliance was and how well it worked during the war. And part of the credit clearly goes to the personal friendships. And at the top, of course, is the Roosevelt-Churchill friendship. It was very real, and it played a key role. And both men knew that they needed to become friends with each other. I tremble at the thought of what would have happened if they didn't like each other, what the world would have come to. What followed World War II, what John Gaddis called the Long Peace, was not simply the Cold War, but along with it, the longest period of peace in the history of modern Europe. Ask yourself why that would have happened. Because the Soviets and the Americans had an understanding in Europe. This was primary interest to both sides. And if either one tried to take any territory from the other, it would mean World War III. That ended, of course, when the Cold War ended. And it's no accident that then warfare in the Balkans exploded. I think at this particular moment, I think I am more fearful than I've ever been in terms of what is going on. And I'm talking globally now, not just nationally. I see globally the rise of beliefs and leaders who remind me very much of leaders that arose during the 1920s and the 1930s. I see a forgetting of the lessons. William Tecumseh Sherman once put it very nicely. He said, "War is hell, but every generation has to learn that for itself." So I'll leave it at that. Otherwise, I might get in serious trouble. So the question is, did the decision to invade North Africa lengthen the war by delaying the Channel crossing? This is an issue that divides historians to this very day. And here's the way it goes. On the one hand, of course it did, because had you been able to cross the Channel in 43, the war would have ended sooner. But could you have successfully crossed the Channel in 43? Those who say no cite the following facts, okay? The war against the German U-boats was not won until May of 1943. Had you attempted to send large numbers of American forces over, many of them would never have gotten there, okay? The air war against the Luftwaffe was not won until the beginning of 1944. In fact, the bombing campaign, for the most part, was a failure until late 1943, when you finally obtained fighter aircraft with the range to accompany bombers all the way into Germany. And what you then did was to force the Luftwaffe up into the air, and in a war of attrition, you basically ended it. You annihilated the German fighter force so that there was no Luftwaffe to challenge the landings in 44. So you put in addition to that, American troops in 1942 were incredibly green. I'll never forget, I was giving a lecture once many years ago, and a British journalist listening to these American plans to cross the Channel in 40. Remember, the British had been kicked off the continent by the German army how many times? Norway, Dunkirk, Greece. So this British journalist said, when he heard about these American plans to land in 42 or 43, said, "When did you Americans begin to take the German army seriously?" I said, "Oh, around the time of Kasserine Pass, February 1943, where Rommel humiliated the Americans in North Africa." So that side says that. Now, there's also the political side of this conflict. And I'm so glad you asked that, because that's what I skimmed very, very quickly when I saw what time it was. I didn't want, because as I said, I could have given a full lecture on that. There was the whole question of keeping Russia in the war, okay? Over 97% of all German combat casualties before D-Day are on the Eastern Front, okay? The United States loses approximately 294,000 combat dead in World War II. The Russians lose more than that in the single battle of Stalingrad. The Soviet death toll is somewhere around 25 to 27 million people. And Churchill admitted the Red Army tore the guts out of the Wehrmacht. You have to keep the Russians in. Now, you've got two problems. One is the military problem of preventing the total defeat of the Red Army, and a cross-channel invasion can take the pressure off them. And the other problem is making sure that Stalin won't sign a separate peace, as in effect he did in 1939. So you've got to show him action. And if the British won't agree to cross the channel, you cannot remain inactive for that very reason. Also, you will lose public support for the Germany first approach. So Roosevelt's insistence is there must be an offensive in the European theater in 1942. And Marshall said in front of the Joint Chiefs, he said, apparently our political system will require action in North Africa in 1942. From the point of view of the Americans, it didn't do anything to help the Russians. That was Stalin's point of view as well. But at least it was some action, and it trained green troops, and it led to knocking Italy out of the war eventually. So there were gains to be made. But whether it was worth the candle, historians cannot agree on this, and whether the channel could have been successfully crossed before 1944, historians cannot agree on. I wish I could give you a straight answer, but again, I can give you a bibliography on both sides on this very important question. The question was, there is a conspiracy theory that Roosevelt and Churchill knew the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming and let it happen as a backdoor to war. Okay. And the evidence, the argument goes, well, we had broken the Japanese code, so we had to know what they were going to do. Why is it that the aircraft carriers, the capital ships, were not in Pearl Harbor on that day? And it goes on and on like that. Okay, number one, no one knew the value of the aircraft carriers until Pearl Harbor, as well as the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. The battleship was still the queen of the fleet. The United States had broken the Japanese diplomatic code, not the naval code. And the diplomatic code said if agreement is not reached with the Americans by the end of November, quote, things are automatically going to happen. Okay? Everyone knew that meant war. In fact, a war warning went out. But where? Why are the Japanese making war? Because the United States had, in effect, put an embargo on them. They couldn't get any oil, any iron, any steel from the United States. So where would they go to get these resources? Southeast Asia. British possessions such as Malaya and Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, which had the oil. And was there an American possession in the way? Yes, the Philippines. So that would be where you would expect an attack to take place. What is extraordinary is that MacArthur got fooled too, even though everyone thought the attack was going to be there. No one thought that the fleet had been put at Pearl Harbor to act as a deterrent to the Japanese. But a deterrent, by definition, is also a target. But it was a target that most considered out of reach. Remember, there really had been no attack like this before, except for one. In 1940, the British had launched a naval air attack against the against the Italian fleet in the Mediterranean using wooden biplanes, to give you some idea of how fast the technology changed. What you have here looks in hindsight, my God, how could they not see it? But one of the most difficult things in history is to forget what you know if you want to understand what the individuals at the time knew and how they acted. One other thing, the backdoor to war theory expects that Hitler, for the first time in his life, would have followed up on a treaty that he had signed. He had broken every treaty he'd ever signed. He did in this case, but no one would have thought that was the case. Conspiracy theories are very popular because, as I said, in hindsight, it looks so clear. And there are a few real conspiracies. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, for example, clearly was part of a conspiracy because they were also going to assassinate the vice president and the secretary of state on the same night. But most of the conspiracy theories just don't stand up to evidence. And I have got a bias here, which my wife picked up very quickly. When she heard conspiracy theories of 9/11, she would say, "My husband is a professional historian. He doesn't believe in conspiracy theories. He thinks human beings are too stupid to pull them off." This conspiracy would have required the entire cabinet to have taken part in it, as well as the Army Chief of Staff, the Navy Chief of Staff. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. What you had here was, as far as I see it, is human error. And the fact that this theory keeps coming back, despite all the evidence against it, it just keeps coming back. There is something in our psyche that simply won't accept that we can make blunders. This was an awful one. But that is, you may disagree, but I will stand by that. If Roosevelt had lived, would he have dropped the atomic bomb? I say absolutely. Of course, we will never know. But the bomb was going to, if the bomb worked, it is the most advanced physics and engineering possible at the time. No one knew if it was going to work until July 16th, 1945 at Alamogordo. If it works, it is a weapon of war and will be used in a total war. The only question, and it's a biggie, is how is it going to be used? The question is often asked, would it have been used against Germany if it had been developed before Germany surrendered? I say yes. It is only in hindsight, but it's an issue that divides historians, again, very, very deeply. But if you attack the dropping of the atomic bomb, then you have to attack the entire doctrine of strategic bombing of civilians, which became a practice of war in World War II. The only difference of the atomic bomb is that it is a single bomb. The firebombing of Tokyo, by the way, probably killed more people than the Hiroshima bomb did. It horrifies us for reasons of, one bomb, radiation, there are a whole host of things. But I think quite clearly it is Roosevelt and Churchill who both started projects and who pooled their resources. And indeed, the two men at their conferences signed a series of agreements. There are many historians who blame Truman for starting the Cold War and not telling Stalin about the bomb. Roosevelt and Churchill signed a memo saying, this shall remain an Anglo-American monopoly in the post-war world, and neither one of us will tell a third party without the consent of the other. The idea of telling Stalin was brought up during the war, and it was vetoed by these two men. So I have no doubt. Of course, it's counterfactual history. It's what if. We will never know. But I see no evidence that Roosevelt would not have used the bomb. The immediate aftermath of the war. There have been a series of books recently that have focused on that. Ronald Spector for Asia, and William Hickok for Europe. You cannot imagine the sheer total devastation. Death toll of about 60 million people. Most of the continents wrecked by the war. The only major belligerent not bombed or invaded was the United States. Everything else is ruins, total ruins. And the descriptions of it are just horrifying. And the attempts to rebuild fail in the early years. There had been a lot of American money poured into Europe in 45 and 46 that didn't work. This is when Marshall comes up with the Marshall Plan, which is for an integrated approach, which does work. And you have the European economic miracle, as it's called, that will follow. But the world, everyone tended, okay, we won the war, let's go home, was the attitude. Let's get home. And the policymakers are saying, Churchill says the United States stands at the pinnacle of the world. Is it going to do something? And if so, what is it going to do? British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin referred to the Marshall Plan as a life raft thrown to a sinking man. Everyone thought Europe was finished and could never come back. We all know, of course, that it did. But beyond that, I would recommend reading what others have had to say here. There was great fear of it. There was great fear of it. This is why Eisenhower behaved as he did in the last weeks of the war. The rumor was, and it was intelligence that told him, Hitler is going to escape Berlin, he's going to go to Berchtesgaden, and he will fight a guerrilla war in the high mountains. And Eisenhower's movement, not to go to Berlin, but to go south, was to cut off this possibility and this escape route. Hitler, of course, decided not to do that. I do not know enough German history to tell you who had been what groups had been trained. My guess is that there were guerrilla units that had been trained, but I don't know that for a fact. It's an interesting question. But Hitler decided not to. It was a great fear of the Allies. Okay? Thank you.